Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, Camille and I begin our look back at the 2023-24 season on an individual basis. Our player report cards and analysis begin today with, I think this is inarguably the most important player on the team, Giannis Antetokounmpo. The word that you'll hear the most about Giannis' season was efficiency. We dig into that, what changed this year versus the previous years, and perhaps more importantly, what needs to change next year for Giannis. We get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia. You can find my work on the Bucks Radio Network, joined by Camille Davis, who you can find on the Technical Foul podcast, the Pack a Day podcast, and before you know it, the Carry the G and MKE podcast with the football season just around the corner. We're going to learn the schedule in a couple of days, Camille. I'm sure you guys have some blowouts planned for that. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's right, $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We had teased these individual lookbacks quite a bit, and we figured it's rather appropriate to start with Giannis and take a look back at his work through the season, what stood out, what changed for the better or worse. And spoiler alert here, wasn't a whole lot in the latter that changed for the worse as we dug through the numbers here for Giannis. But before we get into some of the details of it, just you and I talking before we recorded, and there's a couple of words that are going to come up a lot throughout this show. I may be stealing your thunder with one of them here, but it seemed like efficiency and consistency. When you think back to Giannis through a season full of change, what stood out the most to you?
It was that he was the beacon of consistency for this Bucks team through and throughout. Like, there were nights where you're like, we don't know what we're going to get from Dame, and we will go into the Dame individual episode eventually. And there was a lot that Dame was trying to learn and figure out in his place and everything. And Giannis had to also figure out his place in a certain degree. But, you know, he's been with the Bucks. He's been in Milwaukee. And throughout the year, his performance was consistent. Like, night in and night out, Giannis was the one Buck who you knew, like, we're gonna get our 30 from Giannis. We're gonna get about 10 rebounds or so. Like, you counted on Giannis to come through with that, and he did consistently throughout the year. In a year where he had the most efficient shooting from the field of his career at this point. And that's something I wanted to kind of throw back to you when looking at the consistency part of it, because we talked a lot about what it might look like with Dame and Giannis together and what looks they might be able to give. Like, man, they're going to open up the game so much for each other. And as we've noted, it wasn't as seamless of a transition with that two-man game between those two. But do you think as well, like, just having Dame out there also kind of helped Giannis get some better looks with the efficiency numbers that he had? Or do you just think it was just like he was consistently doing what he was doing, and it just so happened that more shots fell for him?
It's funny because I'm inclined to say, yeah, that Damian Lillard's presence really gave him better looks and created some more efficiency for Giannis. But just digging through some of his more recent seasons. So let's look back at this season. He shot just under 79% effective field goal percentage in the restricted area, 59% in the paint. And, looking back the year prior, 78.6% effectively in the restricted area, 51% in the painted area. So that's the one area where you saw a little bit of change, was right around the free throw line, even though maybe the metrics, or the eye test, I should say, wouldn't necessarily back that up. But we saw more of that from Giannis, more efficiency in that area. And I think you could point to, not being able to bring help to that spot. If Damian Lillard is out there above the break or at the top of the key behind the 3-point line, you can't bring help off of Damian Lillard to Giannis in that spot. So I'm sure he got cleaner looks. I don't think it was a massive upgrade. And I don't mean that as a bad thing
Right.
either, because I think as we'll get to, and we've talked about quite a bit throughout the season, I think that pairing was very much figuring out their partnership all throughout the season. So that would be the one thing I would point to for next year is I wonder what the efficiency is going to look
Mhm.
like then if this is the version of Giannis going forward, because I would assume that two-man game is going to be much more optimized with an offseason of working together, a training camp under Doc Rivers, and just a second season of that familiarity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because one thing we also talked about was like, do we think his numbers will dip with Damian Lillard coming on board as well? And looking at his numbers this season, still averaged 30.4 points a game, a little bit less than what he averaged last year, which was 31.1. So really in that same range, two straight seasons of Giannis averaging at least 30 points per game. The rebounding numbers, 11.5, career high in assist for Giannis this year, 6.5, and that's something that we've talked about a lot with Giannis, where it's like, I feel like we're missing some assists because guys aren't knocking down as many shots. We've always talked about how Giannis is a willing passer, enjoys passing the ball, so seeing him get career high in assists this year was really cool to see. He also had the most double-doubles and triple-doubles in a single season. This past season, he had 57 double-doubles, 10 triple-doubles. Like, the man was on a mission. And just kind of going back and looking through the numbers, we mentioned he was the first player in NBA history to shoot at this level, at least 60% from the field, while averaging at least 30 points from the field. Like, Giannis did some historic things in an already historic career for him. So seeing him find different ways to still, like, man, it's the first time that Giannis has done X, Y, and Z when he is, like 10 years in. It's amazing to see, and which goes back to, I know we'll talk about, but he finished fourth in MVP this year as well, and there were some arguments about where he should stand. And my general thoughts on that was just that his name should have been in the conversation more for what he was doing, but the narrative pieces around it, and then of course the Bucks going on that losing streak towards the end of the year did not help his case. But the game on the court was solid for Giannis.
Yeah, and we shared some of those numbers. I think, look, it's not great to get into here's the numbers show on an audio form, but the big thing was this: he took essentially the same amount of shots as you pointed to. All those numbers basically identical. His per game averages. The one thing worth pointing out is his minutes per game
Mhm.
went up a little bit more. A lot of that we saw under Adrian Griffin. These guys are playing heavy minutes early in the season, but Giannis averaged more than 35 minutes per game. He'd been right around the 32 mark the last couple of seasons, really ever since Bud arrived. 32 seemed to be that sweet spot for him. Took about one fewer shot per game. Again, you got Damian Lillard, so that's going to be the story there. And free throws, his attempts were down by about 1.5 or 2 per game. I don't know about you. I just basically chalk that up to not so much Damian Lillard, but what we started to see in terms of officiating that back
Mhm.
half of the season, I think was a big piece. And then obviously the Damian Lillard inclusion. But with his efficiency, I think what stood out was he took about one more shot per game in the restricted area around the rim and one fewer shot in that mid range that we started to see climb the last couple of years. I know Frank has talked about it quite a bit too, and especially that one handed baby hook and that push shot that you look for that, and that Dirk Nowitzki esque one legged turnaround took a little bit fewer of those this season and took more shots around the rim, which I suppose, would you rather have Giannis shooting around the rim with dunks and layups? Absolutely, because that's going to be 2 points. But we didn't get a chance to see it in this postseason run. That is the thing to keep an eye on. Is that's going to be an important piece for the
Mhm.
Bucks half court offense in the playoffs. It can't just be Damian Lillard and Chris Middleton. It helps to have those two guys, but that's where Giannis's growth in the mid range is going to stand out even more so, good or bad, and he was taking fewer of them this past season. So I wonder if we see that shot diet change a little bit next year.
Yeah, and that's something that I know we're going to talk about ways for him to spend the summer that we would suggest. Of course, we're not coaches or anything like that, but that mid-range piece is something that I would definitely point to, because for years, like when he was younger, the thought was like, man, if Giannis can get a three-point shot, like it's over. Like if he can stretch, it's over. The three-point shot, the three-point shot, the three-point shot. And then we started seeing how Bud was constructing teams around Giannis, and it became kind of clear, like, oh, maybe we don't necessarily need him to shoot threes for him to unlock his next level. But if he can get a mid-range game or a mid-post game, a post game, that could really open some things up, because playoff time is when you normally would see the wall deployed against Giannis, where they're cutting him off from getting to that restricted area where he's so efficient. So it's like, what's your counter if that does happen? Like if you have to go one-on-one and you can't get all the way to the rim, what is your counter? And that's when that mid-range game, mid-post, post game all comes into play. So we'll be interested to see that as well, because we know last summer he spent time with Hakeem as well, working on some post things. So I do wonder how much of that is going to kind of be emphasized in his game as he continues to get older as well, and athleticism starts to fade a little bit. Not saying he won't be able to finish around the rim at all, but just finding more tools to add into your toolbox of how you can score. I mean, I look at LeBron James as somebody who's altered his game a bit as he continued to get older, to include more of those mid-rangers, more of the posts, more of the mid-post. So something I'm also interested in seeing if that's how Giannis starts to go as well as he continues to get older.
Yeah, we're going to take a look at some of those changes. Again, some of it is just going to be, hey, Doc Rivers learning that pairing with Damian Lillard and getting more reps in this system that Doc Rivers is putting in place. So we'll get into that conversation coming up here after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, as we mentioned, time to talk to you about FanDuel. There is no better time to get in on that action, because it is winner take all time right now in the NBA and NHL. And with that, FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, well, and I think it is time to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel, and it's programmed for you every day, bringing you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news. It streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Camille, getting into, again, with the caveat of we're no Phil Beckner and we're not the coaches, but what would I circle as, hey, I think here's everything that went well for you, and we already kind of highlighted that. Giannis basically remained consistent. He was able to get to his spots. He increased getting shots from the area he is most consistent. His counting numbers were basically identical. He was able to play more minutes. He played a lot of games, too. When you think about his games played, total of 73. It's the most games Giannis had played in since the year before Mike Budenholzer arrived, when he played 75 games when he was 23 years old in the 2017-18 season. That, I suppose, we can start with. Do you think we see that number sit in the 70s next season, or do his games played come down? Again, not insinuating injury, but is this just the Bucks looking at it and saying, look, we didn't have you for the playoffs. You went down at the worst possible time. Maybe it is time that we say, hey, I know Giannis is never going to suggest this, but maybe we do need to start to work in more rest days.
I think that's going to be part of the conversation. I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on that. I think that the NBA switching over the awards to having that 65 game minimum played piece of it all has changed the equation a little bit as well for some guys, where if you're thinking about next season, like, hey, maybe the Bucks are going to look to rest him a little bit more. That 65 game mark, I think, is like the bare minimum that he will look to play, because this is perennial MVP candidate. Like, you can't take that money off the table for him. So I don't know if we'll see it as high as 73, but I feel like maybe that 70, high 60s mark might be in line for him. 'Cause I mean, even he mentioned in his exit interview where he's like, maybe I need to rest a little bit more. We heard it during the season with Doc Rivers saying, I don't like heroes in February and March. I like heroes in May and June, meaning like, I don't need you gutting through and playing through injuries at this point in the season. We need you to be as healthy as possible come playoff time. So that's something I do think we might start to see, like 73 games this season. We mentioned it, like Giannis was healthy for most of the season. It was just towards the end of it where things just started going a little bit haywire. So I don't think myself that we'll see him in the like mid 70s flirting with 80. Like, we last saw him play 80 games when he was 22. And I think that might be the case again, just because he's getting a little bit older. And like you mentioned, Giannis is probably not going to go for that. He mentioned it too, like, just because I rest a night in March does not mean that I will be healthy come May. Like, you don't know how that's going to go. And I want to play if I can play. So I'm sure there'll be conversations about that. But my question back to you is thinking about the minutes allocation for Giannis. And you mentioned it's the most minutes that he's played in quite some time here for him. And we know that Mike Budenholzer purposely look to keep his minutes somewhat low to try to keep him fresh throughout the season. And Doc Rivers has mentioned it in spurts throughout the season when he came on, like, he likes to kind of have a tighter rotation through the regular season and get guys ready for those playoff minutes. So next season, do you think that we still see Giannis hovering around that 35-minute mark, or do you think that might drop as well as another way to try to keep him in peak condition come playoff time?
That is the interesting part of the conversation, because so his minutes were about 600 more than he had played the season prior, about three and a half hundred more than he played 2 years prior to that, 600 more than he played the year they won the championship. So again, he hadn't played this many minutes since those 3 years before the arrival of Bud, when he was 21, 22, and 23 years old. There's two ways of looking at it: of, do you want to reduce the games played, or do you want to reduce the minutes played, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah.
I'm kind of the thoughts of, you'll hear kicked around a lot in baseball with pitching of like, well, if he's already up and getting some live reps there, we've kind of wasted that. And it's, the amount of pitch counts that you look at, but when you get a guy up and warming up in the bullpen, then, well, those are already live reps that you're throwing out there on the arm. It's kind of the same thing to me with minutes played in their relationship with games played. If he's already playing in the game, his body's revved up and he's going. So I think the like 33 minutes per game would really be the sweet spot for me. Again, a lot of this is going to depend on what the Bucks have behind Giannis. We know Brook Lopez and Bobby Portis are both under contract. But who knows what changes are going to come, because if you want to do any dramatic tinkering with this roster, those two names and Pat Connaughton are really the tradable contracts, as much as some fans may disagree, but just in terms of their size, those are the tradable contracts you have. The other part of that is, which I think is a larger conversation that we are certainly in favor of, and we will get into when we profile some of the younger guys. If Giannis is playing fewer minutes, well, maybe that means you tinker with things like, do we try Andre Jackson Jr. at the 4 for times and get him some more reps and look at different ways that we can use him, which is going to be very important for this team and for these young players moving forward. The caveat is, look, it's also going to be important to play those guys with Giannis and see how that works and what that looks like. So I would imagine the minutes per game will come down a little bit for Giannis. The games played, I think we were both aligned in this area that I would say the sweet spot would probably be like 67, 68, 69, somewhere around there. Because look, the other part is this, and I did mean to do more research on this, but just didn't get to it. But when you think about this postseason, we've talked about injuries quite a bit, right? I mean, I know some of it is inevitable, but OG Anunoby goes down. The Bucks, obviously, with no Dame for 2 games, with no Giannis in the playoffs. Jalen Brunson is starting to wear down now. So Luka Doncic, clearly not 100%. We've seen injuries, and Kristaps Porzingis have unfortunately become part of the storyline here. Is it coincidental that this is happening the year that the league puts in these restrictions of, hey, you got to play 67 games to be eligible for All NBA? And we saw guys playing more. It was one of the things we were talking about earlier in the season, not just within the Bucks, but league wide. You saw stars playing, and are we seeing the bill come due for that here in the playoffs?
And that was the question, because people were pointing to the Knicks like, well, look at how many minutes they've put on their bodies through the regular season and how they're trucking along. And you're starting to see, I mean, Mitchell Robinson went down again. He's out for the postseason. They had lost Julius Randle. Bogdanovich is out. Like, they've had so many different injuries. And meanwhile, like, people are like, well, look at Josh Hart. Like, he hasn't sat down. And like the fact that he didn't sit down in this series against the Pacers until game 3 in the third quarter, like, crazy to think about. But the league has been putting out information as well, saying like, actually, guys, load management isn't good and people should play. And it's like, for years we've been hearing about load management. So I don't think those conversations are going away anytime soon. It's going to be teams and sports scientists really trying to find the best balance for their guys and for their teams, because as much as you want to try to make sure you get to this point in the season healthy, which of course plays a part in the playoff luck. We've had the conversation before. You can only play who's in front of you. The reality of it is, even the best prepared plans sometimes go awry. So you can only do what you can do. So you don't want to, again, try to be like, well, we're saving you all this way. And then you get there and it still doesn't work. We saw that for years with Kawhi Leonard and the Clippers, where they were trying throughout the season to load management to get them there, get to the playoffs, and doesn't work out. We saw it this year where he plays the most that he's played and it still didn't work out. So it's kind of one of those things where you just have to have kind of like a company policy on how you're approaching it and hope that your version of it gets the best results.
The other thing I'll point out is it wasn't so much, it may have sounded like I was insinuating this, but I wasn't. It wasn't so much that, hey, Giannis played so many minutes because Adrian Griffin was really riding his guys early in the season. He played 35.2 minutes per game in the games played under Griff, 35.3 per game when Doc Rivers arrived. So again, consistency, to go back to that number for Giannis. But some of those other individual things in areas that we would like to see things added for Giannis, we'll take a look at that, and the partnership with Damian Lillard, the importance of that, as we wrap things up here after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, time to talk to you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks, as you know, is the best way to get into fantasy sports here. All you have to do is pick more than or less than in 2 to 6 player stat projections, and from there you can watch the winnings start to pour in. It's playoff time, so no better time to get in on the action and win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during basketball's postseason. And you can win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Turn $10 into $1,000. Basketball playoffs, as we mentioned, hockey playoffs, baseball as well. All of that and all those ways to win on Prize Picks. Again, America's #1 fantasy sports app. So head to Prize Picks, use the code LOCKEDONNBA, and get yourself a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com. And that code again, LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDON, NBA. Use the code and get a first deposit match up to $100 with Prize Picks. All right, I think the areas that we would clearly put the emphasis on, we kind of touched on a few of those, and that is, man, I don't want to get too greedy here, but it would be very nice to see Giannis start to take some more of those mid-range shots. Again, it wasn't a dramatic fall off that we saw there, but I'd like to see some more of those mid-range shots and figure out what things are going to work in the playoffs. We saw some of those work in that 2021 run to the title there. But taking a look at how Giannis can continue to evolve his game, because you've mentioned this before too, Camille. There is always going to be this unavoidable stigma that is attached to Giannis. Maybe largely thanks to one specific player, but just that he is the tall run and dunk man.
Mhm.
And look, I think the other piece of this, and why I am curious to see if that shot diet changes, is this is a very serious injury that Giannis was dealing with and coming back from. And it was not a torn Achilles, thankfully, because if that was, not to say, hey, Giannis can't come back from that, or he will never be the same, but he would not, you would have to assume, be the same. It doesn't mean he's going to all of a sudden become bad, or it's, man, Giannis is washed, but he may drop down to 90% if it's recovering from an Achilles injury. Thankfully, he's not, in his 30s, but that's an injury that we've seen even with guys right around the age of Giannis. It takes something from you when you come back from it. And it's not just the year after your rehab. It takes a little bit of time. I mean, granted, he was older. Kobe Bryant was never the same after that
Mhm.
injury. So thankfully he avoided that, because if that was the case, I think we would have to shift this to, okay, here are some of the things Giannis is going to have to incorporate more. But even just, planning for your future and that transition, Giannis isn't going to be this player forever.
Right.
Look at how LeBron James tweaked his gameplay. You can't always get by in athleticism. You have to add something else. And again, it's not to say that's how he's gotten by, but it's going to be important for Giannis to start to add that. So I am very curious if those numbers we shared, specifically the number of shots he was taking at the rim versus those mid-range, shifted slightly. But I wonder if we see a shift. I wouldn't say more dramatically, because you never want Giannis to not take shots around the rim. But if we do start to see that mid-range number tick upward and maybe even get to an area that is higher than it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like you mentioned, you still want Giannis to be Giannis, right? He is dominant in the restricted area, regardless of the run and dunk man comments. Like, if you watch Giannis play night in and night out, you see the finesse he finishes with. It's not always a dunk when he gets into the restricted area. He's talented to finish with his left hand, his right hand. He has spins. Like, he just has so many different moves around the rim where he's able to score pretty efficiently there, as we have pointed out. So that's a part of his shot diet that, of course, I want to continue to be in there, because he's so gifted in that restricted area. But like we mentioned, the mid-range is definitely an area where I would love to see him continue to improve. The post game is somewhere I love to see him continue to improve, because like you mentioned, we mentioned the LeBron James comp, a player who is kind of a unicorn. Like, we know LeBron's one of the greatest, but to see the way his game has aged for LeBron, it was also adding in that 3-point shot. Now, I know I said like Giannis doesn't need it, but Giannis does, and he'll take a couple of them. And it's always interesting when he's loading the shot up, because sometimes you can tell before he even shoots it, like, oh, this one's probably going to be good, or this one's going to be like this. This is not a good shot for him. So just when he does have the opportunity to knock down wide open ones, like, you want to see those go in. But one other thing, just adding into what I would love to see him spending some time doing this summer, is going to people are like, wait, what? Setting screens. Like, he was put in a lot of actions to set screens, but he's not necessarily the best screen setter necessarily. So like, that's a talent for big men to be able to do as well. So just kind of getting that together and getting more tight on that, and just how he operates in the short roll when he's coming out, just kind of getting used to some of those other developments as well, I think would be really good for him this summer, especially knowing that he has Dame next to him. Because next season, they mentioned it going into the summer, like, it's different knowing you have another star orbiting around you, and how do you make that scene come together a little bit cleaner. And I know towards the end of the season, but maybe he's setting too many screens at this point for Dame, and they need to get that balance a little bit back. But the quality of the screen is really important as well. The angles, how Dame wants it set, how does that differ from how Chris wants it set, so on and so forth. So that's another area in Giannis's game where this summer, like, if we can get the screening game up a little bit more, I think that'll be really beneficial to the entire team.
The quality of them, I think, is big,
Yeah.
and that's a big piece that you mentioned there, because we saw Damian Lillard have a lot of comfort instantly with Brook Lopez because of
Yep.
the screens that Brook Lopez set. So, Giannis will slip quite a bit and roll to the rim, and it's not quite as impactful of a screen as Brooke Lopez sets. So if you can see that, just get a little bit more physical. That would be one change to point to as well. I think those are the big things, really, right? That you look at. Giannis is a screen setter, and that pairing with Damian Lillard, how that can impact that and help Giannis get to his spots by freeing up Damian Lillard to create some other opportunities for Giannis and everybody else on the floor. And again, just continuing to tinker with that mid-range. As we mentioned on the show earlier, Phil Beckner is going to be working with both of those guys, with Giannis and Dame. He has, of course, worked with Dame through the years. Would you call him a shooting coach? He's more of a development coach, but he does have some individual shooting drills that he does. Again, I add that with the caveat of don't expect Giannis is going to come back. If he does, great, but don't expect Giannis is going to come into the season and say, man, I worked with Phil Beckner. I'm all of a sudden going to be pushing 37% on my threes. But the one other thing I would point to in terms of an individual ask, because this, we waited this long to mention it. This is ultimately going to be the biggest individual development that could come the way of Giannis and this team. And that is, you already know where I'm headed.
Mm-hmm.
If he can get that number, 70, 72, 75 would be fantastic. But
outstanding.
If you can give me 70, low 70s at the free throw line, perfect. We saw stretches of that this season, and there was that stretch for about a month where Giannis was really, really good and around 75% at the free throw line, but ultimately finished 66%. This after 65% last year. The year the Bucks defended the title, he was a 72% free throw shooter, and he was getting there more than 11 times per game. So again, that's another number that we've seen Giannis become an MVP, and he was even in the low 70s at his free throw percentage the first year under Bud. But the years prior to that, you look back at 76%, 77%, 72%, 74%. So what happened between 2019 basically on is anyone's guess, but that's the big thing. I know he's been tinkering with a lot of different routines and rhythms. And look, I think finding one consistent thing that works. And again, maybe that's where Phil Beckner is going to help Giannis and help out that pairing of he and Damian Lillard. But that to me is the biggest thing. Like, we all want to see that mid-range game improve, the screen setting, all that. Yeah, that's going to help the team. But the thing that's going to help the team most is if Giannis becomes a consistently 70% or better free throw shooter, because then late game situations, we already know Damian Lillard is the last guy that we want to foul on the floor. Chris Middleton's a pretty good free throw shooter. Brooke Lopez is under contract, assuming he's on this team. Brooke Lopez has been a pretty good free throw shooter. Missed some in that series against the Pacers, but Doc Rivers said, I think that was fatigue. We played him a lot. So if Giannis can get there, that changes a lot of things with what teams are going to do. And it's not so much, hey, we got to foul Giannis. Even people pointing back to the close of game 5, I think, against the Heat 2 years ago, when Giannis gave the ball up to Chris Middleton. It caused a turnover because he didn't want to go to the free throw line. Editorializing there. We think he didn't want to go to the free throw line. But that, to me, is the biggest thing. If you can find some consistency, and again, 72% would be fantastic if you could live with that.
Yeah, because not even asking for an absurd, like, you're not saying like shoot 85% from the free throw line.
Right.
But one thing I'll just add to that as we wrap up is how important that is, given the fact that he is with Dame. And we saw at the beginning of the season in particular, like, those were Dame and Giannis, two of the guys who got to the free throw line the most. So when you have two of those guys on your team, and we saw it for years, even in Philly, when it was Embiid and Harden, where you're like, God, like, these are some free throw merchants. Like, if they don't have it going, they're going to find a way to get to the line to make something happen. So yeah, absolutely agree with you on the free throws.
And wrapping things up here. So we'll do this with all of these players that we spotlight. The contract situation for Giannis, he's at the Supermax next year. So he's going to be just under $49 million, exact same figure as Damian Lillard. The year afterwards, the 25-26 season, he's under contract for $54.2 million. And then you still have him for the 26-27 season, when that number jumps up to 58.6. It is the 27-28 season where Giannis has the player option. The 26-27 season, we'll get into that with Damian Lillard, is when Dame has the player option. So what you know is Giannis and Damian Lillard are both under contract together through the 25-26 season. So next season and one more. And that's important when we talk about windows and how much longer does this team have. The other things I would throw your way, best case scenario for Giannis, I think it's pretty clear. Best case scenario, he wins his third MVP would be the thing that we would look to there. So we'll continue our look through the roster here, the look back at how the rest of these players performed for the Bucks, some other areas. And granted, there's a lot more to get into for some of these guys and areas to improve and what to look for Giannis. Not a whole lot. Just keep doing what you're doing and improve on the edges there in the margins with some of those things that we spotlighted. Coming up on tomorrow's show, we are going to be joined by Brian Sampson, who runs the Bucks Film Room Twitter account and to podcast, get his take on the Bucks last season, some differences, if any, that he noticed. I would hope he did between Adrian Griffin and Doc Rivers and the Bucks under them. His takeaways on that series against the Indiana Pacers, and then thoughts going into next season. What are some of the changes the Bucks need to make, whether it be system-wise or personnel? So we'll get into that conversation with Brian coming up on tomorrow's show. That'll do it for today. For Camille, I am Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.